I remember the sound before I remembered my own name. It was the steady, mechanical beep of a heart monitor somewhere beside me, cutting through the silence one pulse at a time. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy, and every attempt to open them sent a sharp H through my head. When I finally managed to focus, I found myself staring at a white hospital ceiling that I had never seen before. A nurse noticed my eyes were open and hurried toward my bed. "Claire, can you hear me?" she asked softly. I nodded because speaking felt impossible. My throat was dry, my body weak, and my thoughts scattered like broken glass. She offered me a cup of water with a straw before pressing a button near my bed. "The doctor will be right in. You've been asleep for a long time." A long time. Those words didn't make sense until Drudar Hannah Cole entered the room carrying a tablet. She smiled professionally before checking several numbers on the monitor beside me. "Good morning. Claire, how are you feeling?" "Confused," I whispered. "What happened?" She paused for a moment before answering. "You've been unconscious for 14 days. 14 days. I repeated the number silently, hoping it would somehow become less unbelievable the second time. 2 entire weeks had disappeared from my life. "Was there a car accident?" I asked. "The police believe you suffered a serious fall in the parking structure outside your family's headquarters. You hit your head hard enough to cause a traumatic brain injury, but you're fortunate. Your scans look encouraging, and we expect most of your memory to return over time." "Most?" She nodded carefully. "It's common for patients to lose memories surrounding the trauma. Don't force yourself to remember. If those memories return, they'll usually come back gradually." After asking me a few routine questions about my birthday, my address, and today's date, she seemed satisfied that my mind was otherwise functioning normally. Before leaving, she looked directly at me. "Your family has been waiting every day for you to wake up." I wasn't sure why, but that sentence didn't comfort me. A few minutes later, the door opened again. My mother rushed in first. Margaret Bennett wrapped her arms around me as gently as she could, tears filling her eyes. "Thank God," she whispered. "We were so worried." My father followed behind her. Richard Bennett, chairman of Bennett Industrial, looked exhausted, yet strangely distant. Instead of hugging me, he simply nodded once. "It's good to see you awake." Nathan entered last. My older brother looked exactly the way he always did during board meetings. Perfectly dressed, perfectly confident, perfectly controlled. But something was different. He refused to look directly at me. "You scared everyone," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. I studied each of their faces. Something wasn't right. They looked relieved that I had survived, but they also looked nervous that I was awake. "What happened after the board meeting?" I asked. The room instantly became silent. Mom looked at Dad. Dad glanced toward Nathan. Nathan finally cleared his throat. "You shouldn't be thinking about work right now." "I'm not asking about work," I replied. "I'm asking what happened. The doctor said you need to rest." "Nathan." My voice came out stronger this time. "Answer the question." He shifted uncomfortably before forcing another smile. "Some memories are better left alone." My heartbeat quickened. Why would my own brother say something like that? I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the pounding inside my skull. Slowly, pieces of that morning began floating back into place. I saw the executive boardroom, the long walnut table, my grandfather's portrait hanging above the fireplace, 12 members of our family council sitting in silence, my father standing at the head of the table, Nathan delivering the speech he had rehearsed for weeks. He talked about tradition, legacy, and continuing our family's success. Everyone listened proudly. They always listened to Nathan. Ever since we were children, he had been treated like the future of the Bennett family. I was simply the dependable daughter who quietly solved problems while someone else accepted the applause. My grandfather had always hated that. "Leadership isn't inherited," he used to tell me. "It's earned every single day." Those words echoed through my mind as the memory became clearer. My father stood and announced the final vote to select the next CEO of Bennett Industrial. Every family member voted. One after another, they supported Nathan without hesitation. Then all eyes turned toward me. I was the final vote because my grandfather had written a special provision into the family trust years earlier. If the council couldn't reach unanimous confidence in a successor, my vote carried decisive authority. Nathan smiled at me as though the outcome had already been decided. "Go ahead, Claire," he said confidently. "Let's make history." I looked down at the folder in front of me. Inside were financial reports I had spent months reviewing in secret. They weren't enough to accuse Nathan of a crime, but they were more than enough to convince me he wasn't ready to lead the company our grandfather had built from nothing. I took a slow breath before speaking. I vote no. Every sound inside the room disappeared. My mother stared at me in disbelief. My father looked embarrassed. Nathan laughed once, shaking his head as though I had just made a joke. "You're serious?" he asked. "Completely. You're choosing to humiliate this family. I'm choosing to protect it." I placed several documents onto the conference table, but no one reached for them. My father pushed the papers back toward me without even reading the first page. "We'll discuss those another time. If Nathan becomes CEO today?" I answered calmly. "There may not be another time." Nathan's expression hardened instantly. "You've always been jealous because everyone knew I was supposed to lead." I stood, gathered my folder, and walked toward the door without answering. Behind me I heard him say, "You'll regret this." The memory jumped again. I was leaving the building, walking alone across the underground parking garage. My phone vibrated in my hand. An unknown number flashed across the screen before disappearing. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Fast, closing the distance. Someone called my name. "Claire!" I turned my head toward the voice, and everything went black. I opened my eyes back in the hospital room, breathing so hard the heart monitor began beeping faster. Nathan was still standing beside my bed, watching me carefully. I looked straight at him. "What happened in that parking garage?" He froze for several seconds before quietly saying, "I think there are some memories you're better off never getting back." I spent 3 more days in the hospital before the doctors finally cleared me to go home, but nothing felt like home anymore. My memories returned in fragments, never in order, and every new piece only created more questions than answers. My parents insisted I stay at the family estate until I fully recovered, claiming it would be easier to monitor my health there. I agreed, not because I trusted them, but because I needed to understand what had happened while I had been unconscious. The Bennett estate had always looked impressive from the outside. The stone walls, the perfectly trimmed gardens, and the long driveway gave visitors the impression of a close family that had built something meaningful together. Growing up there taught me that appearances could be more carefully managed than financial statements. Inside those walls, everything revolved around Nathan. It always had. When we were children, Nathan broke rules and everyone laughed because he was spirited. I followed every rule and nobody noticed because that was simply what Claire was expected to do. When Nathan barely passed his exams, my mother celebrated his effort with a weekend trip. When I graduated at the top of my law school class, my father congratulated me by asking if I could review one of the company's contracts before dinner. Even then I convinced myself they weren't playing favorites. I told myself families were complicated. My grandfather was the only person who never pretended things were equal. One afternoon, when I was 16, he found me sitting alone after Nathan had once again received praise for a project I had quietly completed for him. Grandpa sat beside me without saying anything for a while. Finally, he asked, "Does it bother you?" I shrugged because admitting the truth felt childish. He's the oldest. Dad says people naturally look to him. Grandpa smiled sadly. People often mistake confidence for character. I never forgot that sentence. Years after becoming a corporate governance attorney, I began helping Bennett Industrial review compliance policies and board procedures. I wasn't employed by the company full-time. That had been my father's decision. He insisted it looked better if I remained independent while offering legal advice as needed. At first I believed him. Later I realized keeping me outside daily operations also kept me away from decisions Nathan made behind closed doors. Even so, I gradually noticed patterns that didn't make sense. Vendors were being approved unusually quickly. Several long-term suppliers quietly disappeared. New consulting firms received large retainers despite producing almost no measurable work. Every time I asked Nathan about the expenses, he laughed. "You lawyers always see ghosts in spreadsheets." Dad usually ended those conversations the same way. "Nathan understands operations, you understand regulations. Stay in your lane." It became a family joke. Every holiday dinner eventually turned into another reminder that Nathan would someday become CEO while I would always be, or brilliant legal expert. The more they repeated it, the more Nathan started believing the company already belonged to him. About 6 months before Grandpa's annual memorial gathering, I discovered the first document that truly worried me. A capital investment worth several $1 million had been approved using an emergency authorization process that required unanimous executive review. The signatures looked complete, but one approval was missing from the digital record: mine. According to policy, I should have been consulted because I served as legal oversight for governance matters. I wasn't. When I quietly asked the finance department for supporting documents, the controller looked uncomfortable. Nathan said everything was already cleared. By whom? I asked. He hesitated just long enough to tell me everything. The chairman's office. My father's office. I didn't accuse anyone. Instead, I started collecting copies of reports at home. Every evening after work, I compared approvals, invoices, committee minutes, and electronic timestamps. Most differences were small, too small to prove intent, but together they formed a pattern that refused to disappear. Then one evening my mother invited me to dinner alone. I thought she finally wanted to understand my concerns. Instead, she poured me a glass of wine and reached across the table. "Claire, your father is getting older? I know. Nathan needs your support." I smiled politely. Support and blind approval aren't the same thing. Her expression tightened. "You always make everything more difficult than it has to be. Because I ask questions. Because you never trust your own family." That sentence stayed with me all night. The truth was exactly the opposite. I had trusted them for 27 years. They simply expected that trust to flow in one direction. A week before the board vote, Nathan invited me into his office. His confidence bordered on arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands behind his head, and smiled. "You know the vote is just a formality, is it? Dad has already spoken to everyone? Except me." He laughed. "You'll do the right thing." What if the right thing isn't what you want? His smile disappeared for just a second before returning even wider. "Claire, this company has always needed one leader. Families don't survive when siblings compete." I looked him straight in the eyes. Families don't survive when one child believes the rules don't apply to him. For the first time in years, Nathan's face hardened. He stood and walked around his desk until we were only a few feet apart. "Be careful," he said quietly. "You're confusing your education with authority." I left without answering, but deep down I knew something had changed. Nathan wasn't simply expecting to become CEO anymore. He believed anyone standing in his way, including his own sister, had become an obstacle that needed to be removed. That realization seemed impossible at the time. Lying awake in my old bedroom at the family estate after leaving the hospital, I convinced myself I was letting fear distort my judgment. Then my phone vibrated with an encrypted message from Daniel Ross, the company's senior compliance investigator. It contained only one sentence: "Don't discuss the accident with anyone in your family. Your company account was accessed while you were unconscious. We need to meet immediately." I barely slept that night. Daniel's message kept replaying in my mind long after I turned my phone face down on the bedside table. There was only one reason he would risk sending something like that while I was still recovering. Whatever he had found was serious enough that he didn't trust company communication anymore. I left the house early the next morning before anyone else was awake. My mother had insisted I continue resting for another week, but I knew if I stayed inside that house much longer, I would never learn the truth. Daniel had chosen a small cafe nearly 30 minutes outside the city, the kind of place where no executives from Bennett Industrial would ever hold meetings. He was already sitting in the corner when I arrived, a laptop closed in front of him and 2 untouched cups of coffee on the table. He looked relieved to see me alive. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. "Neither should you." "Probably not." We both smiled for a second, but neither of us meant it. Daniel had worked in compliance for almost 12 years. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't paranoid. He believed in facts, audit trails, and documentation. If he looked worried, there was always a reason. He slid a printed report across the table. "Read the highlighted sections first." I lowered my eyes to the page. The report listed login activity connected to my corporate credentials. My stomach tightened almost immediately. My account had been accessed multiple times while I was lying unconscious in the hospital. The timestamps covered nearly every day I had been in intensive care. "That's impossible," I whispered. "I never gave anyone my password." Daniel nodded. "I know. Who accessed it? That's the problem." He turned another page toward me. Someone used your credentials from inside executive headquarters. I stared at the report again, hoping I had misunderstood. The activity included document approvals, governance reviews, and internal communications that appeared to carry my authorization. These aren't my decisions. I know. Can they prove it wasn't me? Daniel took a slow breath. Some of it, yes, your hospital records help. But whoever did this knew enough about our systems to avoid leaving obvious fingerprints. My pulse quickened. Why would anyone need my account? Because your approval carries legal weight. The answer hit me harder than I expected. Whoever had used my identity hadn't stolen money from my bank account. They had stolen my credibility. Daniel opened his laptop and showed me another document. Several governance committee meetings had taken place while I was unconscious. My attendance was recorded. My vote was recorded. My electronic approval appeared on resolutions I had never even seen. No, I said firmly. I would never approve these. I believe you. Does anyone else? Daniel hesitated. That hesitation answered the question before he spoke. Most people assume the records are accurate. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the room grow colder. Nathan. Daniel looked around the cafe before lowering his voice even further. I don't know. But every authorization benefited projects under his direct supervision. I closed my eyes. My grandfather had always warned me that governance failures rarely began with one massive crime. They began with small compromises that everyone agreed to ignore. Suddenly the board vote didn't feel like the beginning anymore. It felt like the final chapter of something much older. Before I could ask another question, Daniel pushed a flash drive across the table. There's more? What's on it? Server backups. I copied them before someone ordered the files deleted. I looked at him in disbelief. Deleted? Yesterday morning. Who gave the order? Officially? He gave a humorless smile. Executive management. My hands tightened around the flash drive. Someone was cleaning up evidence while I was still recovering in a hospital bed. There's something else. Daniel continued. Someone requested a medical evaluation claiming you were mentally unfit to participate in governance decisions. I stared at him. What? He opened another document. There it was. A proposal recommending the temporary suspension of my voting authority because my injuries supposedly made me incapable of exercising independent judgment. This was never approved, Daniel said quickly. But it was drafted. Who drafted it? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned the document toward me so I could read the signature block myself. Nathan Bennett. I felt every muscle in my body tense. He tried to remove me while I was unconscious. It looks that way. Anger rose inside me, but underneath it was something far worse, sadness. Nathan wasn't reacting to one disagreement anymore. He was trying to erase me from the company completely. My own brother had looked at my hospital bed and seen an opportunity. We left the cafe separately to avoid attracting attention. Before leaving, Daniel stopped beside my car. Be careful. About Nathan. About everyone? What does that mean? I don't know who knew what. I only know your account wasn't accessed by one person acting alone. Driving back toward headquarters, I realized I couldn't trust assumptions anymore. I needed evidence, real evidence. That afternoon I requested access to archived board materials through official legal channels. Less than an hour later, I received a formal response from corporate administration denying my request due to temporary governance restrictions. Governance restrictions. Nobody had informed me that such restrictions even existed. Furious, I drove straight to headquarters. The receptionist who had greeted me with a smile for years suddenly became uncomfortable when she saw me. I'm sorry, Ms. Bennett? Don't be. I smiled politely. I just need access to the legal archives. She avoided my eyes. I can't authorize that anymore. Why not? She swallowed. Mr. Bennett issued new instructions. Which Mr. Bennett? She didn't answer because she didn't have to. Nathan appeared moments later at the end of the lobby, surrounded by two senior executives. He walked toward me confidently, stopping just a few feet away. You should be recovering. I should also have access to my own files. Not until your medical leave ends. Medical leave? I asked. I never requested medical leave. Nathan folded his arms. The board agreed it was in everyone's best interest. Which board? His smile returned, calm and perfectly rehearsed. The one you're no longer allowed to vote on. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, I realized I wasn't simply investigating what had happened during those missing 2 weeks. I was fighting to prove I still belonged inside the company my grandfather had trusted me to protect. And as I stood there watching my brother calmly strip away my authority piece by piece, my phone vibrated with a new message from an unknown number. It contained only 7 words. Check your grandfather's private safety deposit box. Immediate. I drove straight from headquarters to the small private bank where my grandfather had kept his personal records for decades. The anonymous message kept echoing in my mind. Check your grandfather's private safety deposit box. Immediately. Whoever sent it knew something that could change everything, and after what I had already discovered, I couldn't afford to ignore even the smallest lead. The bank manager recognized me the moment I walked through the door. Mr. Lawson had worked with my grandfather for almost 20 years and looked genuinely surprised to see me. Claire, he said warmly, I'm glad to see you're feeling better. We heard about your accident. Thank you. I need to access my grandfather's safety deposit box. His expression immediately became more serious. Of course, please follow me. He led me downstairs into the secure vault. After verifying my identity, he unlocked the box and quietly stepped outside to give me privacy. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled out the contents. There were old family photographs, handwritten letters, several legal folders, and a thick sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, for Claire. Open only if you no longer know who to trust. My heartbeat accelerated. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the first page. Claire, if you're reading this, then the situation I feared has finally arrived. I hope I was wrong, but hope has never been a governance strategy. That sounded exactly like him. He believed emotions belonged at home and principles belonged everywhere. The letter explained that during the last years of his life he had quietly noticed troubling changes inside the company. Certain executives stopped asking difficult questions. Family loyalty had begun replacing professional accountability. Most importantly, he worried that future leadership decisions would be based on birth order instead of character. Near the bottom of the page he wrote something that made me stop breathing for a moment. Never assume the greatest threat comes from outside the family. Companies usually survive competitors. They rarely survive entitlement. Under the letter sat another document labeled Integrity Clause. I unfolded it carefully. It was an amendment to the family's governance charter that I had never seen before. According to the document, if substantial evidence showed that a CEO or CO candidate intentionally violated fiduciary obligations, concealed material information from the board, or manipulated governance procedures, an independent review committee would automatically assume temporary control over executive authority. Even more surprising, my grandfather had appointed me as the initial guardian responsible for activating that review process if such evidence ever existed. I read the clause 3 times before I accepted it was real. Nathan had no idea this document existed. My father probably didn't either. The amendment had been signed by my grandfather, witnessed by 2 independent attorneys, and officially notarized. It was legally enforceable. Beneath it rested one final note. Power should never belong to the loudest voice. It should belong to the person willing to protect what is right when standing alone. I closed my eyes. Suddenly the board vote made sense. Grandpa hadn't given me the deciding vote because I was his favorite. He had given it to the one grandchild he believed would choose integrity over family pressure. Before leaving the bank, I photographed every page and placed the originals back inside the envelope. As I reached the door, Mr. Lawson called my name. Your grandfather left one additional instruction. I turned around. He opened a drawer behind his desk and handed me a small brass key attached to an old leather tag. Said to give you this only if you ever open the safety deposit box. What does it unlock? He smiled apologetically. He never told me. The mystery surrounding my grandfather seemed to grow with every answer. Instead of returning home, I drove to Daniel's apartment. He examined the integrity clause carefully before looking up at me in disbelief. This changes everything. That's what I thought. If the evidence supports misconduct, Nathan's appointment can be suspended automatically. Only if we prove it. Daniel nodded. Then we prove it. We spent the next several hours reviewing server backups stored on the flash drive he had given me. At first the files appeared ordinary, internal emails, committee minutes, calendar invitations. Then Daniel noticed something unusual. Look at this. He enlarged a system log showing several deleted surveillance recordings from the underground parking garage. Every camera covering the area where I supposedly fell had been erased within hours of my hospitalization. Can they be recovered? I asked. Possibly. How? The Central Archive creates hidden backup fragments before permanent deletion. Hope returned for the first time since I woke up. If even part of the footage survived, it might finally explain what happened during those missing seconds before everything went black. Daniel contacted an outside digital forensics specialist he trusted. The expert agreed to examine the corrupted archive without informing anyone inside Bennett Industrial. We waited nearly 2 agonizing days for an answer. During that time, my family became increasingly impatient. My mother called repeatedly, asking why I refused to return home. My father insisted the company needed unity, not investigations. Nathan left a voicemail that sounded almost friendly. Claire, whatever you're trying to prove, let's handle it privately. That message alone convinced me I was getting close to something important. Nathan had never asked for privacy before. He preferred public victories. On the third afternoon, Daniel burst into my temporary office carrying a hard drive. His face told me everything before he spoke. We recovered part of the footage. My heart nearly stopped. He connected the drive to his computer and pressed play. The video quality was poor, with several damaged sections, but it clearly showed me leaving the headquarters carrying my legal folder. I answered my phone while walking toward my car. A few seconds later, another figure entered the frame. Because of the damaged recording, the face wasn't immediately visible, but the person's build looked painfully familiar. The figure moved quickly toward me just before the video froze for several seconds. When the recording resumed, I was already on the ground. My folder had scattered across the concrete floor. The other person stood over me for less than 2 seconds before disappearing out of frame. Daniel paused the video. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, "Whoever this is, they didn't call for help." I stared at the frozen image until my eyes hurt. The figure's face remained hidden by the damaged footage, but one detail survived clearly enough to make my blood run cold. The person wore a custom silver cufflink engraved with the Bennett family crest. Only 3 people owned that design: my father, Nathan, and me. I slowly looked down at my own wrists. I wasn't wearing cufflinks that day, which meant one terrifying possibility remained. Someone inside my own family had been standing over me while I lay unconscious on the cold concrete, and instead of helping me, they walked away. I watched that recovered footage so many times that the image began to feel burned into my mind: the damaged frame, the concrete floor, my body lying still beside scattered documents, the figure standing over me for 2 seconds too long, wearing a cufflink only a Bennett man would own. I wanted to believe there was another explanation. I wanted to believe the recording had distorted the truth, that the person had run to call for help, that my family had not crossed the line my heart was already afraid they had crossed. But evidence did not care what I wanted. Daniel tried to zoom in on the face, but the corrupted section broke apart every time he enhanced it. "We need more than this," he said. "A cufflink won't be enough." "I know." My voice sounded calmer than I felt. "Then we keep going." That became the beginning of my plan. Not revenge in the way people imagine it. I did not want to scream at Nathan in the lobby or accuse my father at dinner without proof. I did not want drama. I wanted a record so clean that no one in my family could dismiss it as grief, jealousy, or head trauma. The first thing I did was move out of the family estate. I told my mother I needed quiet to recover. She cried, accused me of shutting them out, and then handed the phone to my father, who immediately made it about the company. "Claire, this is not the time to create more division." "Dad, I almost died." He went silent for half a second. "Heard we are grateful you survived, but the board is already uneasy. Nathan is trying to stabilize things. Nathan tried to suspend my vote while I was unconscious. That was temporary. It was opportunistic." His voice hardened. "You are not thinking clearly." That was when I understood how they planned to handle me. If I questioned them, I was unstable. If I asked for documents, I was paranoid. If I remembered anything, I was confused. My injury had become their favorite excuse, so I stopped trying to convince them. I rented a small, furnished apartment under my middle name through a friend from law school. Daniel used vacation days to continue helping me off the record. Evelyn Shaw, the independent board member who had warned me about my grandfather's hidden document, agreed to meet us in person only after I sent her a copy of the integrity clause. She read it in silence inside a quiet conference room at a public library, then removed her glasses and looked at me with a sadness that felt almost maternal. Your grandfather trusted you more than anyone realized. Wish he told me sooner. Maybe he knew that if you had this power too early, your family would have spent years trying to take it from you. She wasn't wrong. Evelyn had served on the board for 9 years. She had watched Nathan charm investors, flatter vendors, and turn every mistake into someone else's responsibility. She had also watched my father shield him. Richard isn't dishonest by nature, she said carefully, but he has a dangerous weakness. Nathan, she nodded. He sees your brother as proof that the Bennett name will continue. You were always the protection plan, Claire. Nathan was the dream. That hurt, even though I already knew it. Being useful was not the same as being loved. We built the case in layers. Daniel recovered deleted email threads showing that Nathan had requested urgent governance approvals during the exact days I was unconscious. Evelyn provided board minutes that had been edited after meetings. I obtained hospital records proving I could not have logged into any corporate system when my account approved those resolutions. Then we found the first financial thread. A consulting firm called Northbridge Strategic Partners had received 3 large payments over 8 months. The invoices described succession planning advisory services. But there were no reports, no presentations, no deliverables. The company's registered address led to a small mailbox service in Delaware. Daniel traced the ownership through 2 holding entities before the trail reached a name I recognized. Marcus Bennett, my cousin. Nathan's best friend since childhood. So Nathan was funneling company money to family allies, I said. Daniel shook his head. It gets worse. He showed me another payment, then another. Northbridge wasn't the only shell vendor. There were 5, each connected to someone loyal to Nathan. None of them alone would destroy him. Together they proved he had been building a private support network inside the company, using corporate funds to reward people who would back his promotion. My grandfather's clause suddenly felt less like a legal tool and more like a warning left by a man who had seen the storm before anyone else. Still, the missing piece remained the parking garage. We needed to know who had been there. For that, I used the brass key Mr. Lawson had given me. It took 3 days to discover what it opened. Not a drawer, not a cabinet, a storage unit registered under my grandfather's old personal trust. Inside were boxes of company history, handwritten journals, and one outdated computer tower wrapped in plastic. Daniel almost laughed when he saw it. Your grandfather was old school. He also trusted paper more than people. The computer barely turned on, but when it did, we found archived correspondence between Grandpa and the attorneys who drafted the integrity clause. More importantly, we found a private memo listing the 3 Bennett crest cufflinks he had commissioned years ago. 1 pair for my father, 1 pair for Nathan, and 1 single pair he had kept for himself, never given away. I stared at the memo. So there are only 2 active pairs, your father's and Nathan's, Daniel said. Unless someone had access to your grandfather's set, I knew exactly where Grandpa's personal effects had gone after his funeral. My father's study. That evening, I did something I never thought I would do. I returned to the estate and pretended I was there to see my mother. She looked relieved enough not to question me. While she made tea, I slipped into my father's study and opened the old mahogany drawer beneath Grandpa's portrait. The velvet cufflink box was still there, empty. My stomach dropped. Someone had taken Grandpa's pair, which meant the cufflink in the footage did not prove whether the person was my father or Nathan. It proved something worse. Someone had gone into Grandpa's belongings, taken a symbol of his legacy, and worn it the day I was left unconscious in the garage. I photographed the empty box and left before anyone noticed. The next morning, Evelyn called an emergency meeting with the Independent Review Committee. We did not reveal the integrity clause yet. We only requested a preliminary audit of succession, related spending, governance approvals, and system access during my hospitalization. Nathan heard about the request within hours. By sunset, he called me directly. I let it ring until voicemail picked up. His message was quiet, almost friendly, and far more frightening than anger. Claire, I don't know who you're talking to, but you're making this harder than it needs to be. If you keep digging, you're going to hurt people you still care about. I saved the voicemail, forwarded it to Daniel and Evelyn, and wrote only one sentence beneath it: "Add this to the file." Nathan had no idea how much that voicemail helped me. He thought it sounded like an older brother trying to calm an emotional sister before she made another mistake. To me, it sounded like someone who knew exactly what I was getting close to. Daniel agreed the moment he listened to it. "Who's nervous?" he said. "Not scared, yet nervous." There was a difference. Nervous people tried to negotiate. Scared people made mistakes. We needed Nathan to become scared. That didn't mean provoking him publicly. It meant quietly removing every illusion that he still controlled the board. Evelyn arranged the preliminary audit under the authority of the Independent Governance Committee, carefully avoiding any mention of my grandfather's integrity clause. Officially, the review was only intended to verify succession procedures following concerns about documentation during my hospitalization. Nathan underestimated it immediately. He believed another internal review could be managed the same way every previous question had been managed, with charm, confidence, and my father's influence. For several days, nothing appeared to happen. Employees continued working. Investors heard nothing. The media remained unaware. On the surface, Bennett Industrial looked exactly the same. Underneath, every financial authorization connected to Nathan was being examined line by line. Daniel worked almost without sleeping. Every time he found a questionable payment, another trail appeared behind it. Several executive bonuses had been approved outside policy. Vendor contracts repeatedly bypassed competitive review. Internal compliance warnings had quietly disappeared before reaching the full board. None of those findings alone destroyed Nathan's position. Together, they revealed a pattern no independent auditor could ignore. 3 days into the investigation, the auditors found another shell company, related to Northbridge. Indirectly. Different name, same money. I drove straight to her office. The audit team had converted one of the unused conference rooms into a temporary document center. Banker boxes covered nearly every wall. Printed ledgers lay across long tables beside laptops, displaying spreadsheets that stretched for hundreds of rows. One forensic accountant looked up as I entered. Bennett? Yes. We've identified over 40 transactions requiring additional explanation. 40, he nodded. And that's only the first review. Daniel joined us carrying another folder. Gets worse. I was beginning to hate those 4 words. He opened the folder to reveal executive travel expenses. Nathan had charged dozens of luxury trips to corporate development, claiming they involved investor meetings. The meetings existed. The investors did not. Hotel records, flight manifests, and reimbursement requests told entirely different stories. Someone had built a remarkably sophisticated system of small deceptions. Nothing extravagant enough to attract immediate attention. Just enough to slowly normalize dishonesty. How long? I asked quietly. Daniel looked at the oldest record. At least 5 years. 5 years. Long before Grandpa died. Long before the CO vote. Long before my accident. The succession battle had never been the beginning. It had simply become the point where hidden misconduct could no longer remain hidden. That afternoon, my father requested a private meeting. Against Daniel's advice, I agreed. We met in the old library at the family estate, the same room where Grandpa had taught me to read annual reports before I was old enough to understand balance sheets. Dad stood beside the fireplace holding 2 glasses of iced tea. "I thought we could talk without lawyers," he said. "I'm not here with lawyers. Not physically." He handed me a glass. I left it untouched. "Dad, why did you approve suspending my voting rights while I was unconscious?" He looked genuinely uncomfortable. Because the company needed stability. Or because Nathan needed one less obstacle. His jaw tightened. "Everything isn't about Nathan." Then answer the question honestly. He walked toward the window overlooking the gardens. "Your brother has flaws. That's the first honest thing you've said in weeks." He ignored the interruption. "But he's also spent his entire life preparing to lead this company. Preparation doesn't excuse misconduct." "Those are allegations." I slowly removed several copied financial reports from my bag and placed them on the coffee table. "No, these are documents." He glanced at them without picking them up, exactly as he had done during the board meeting. The gesture alone told me everything. He didn't want evidence. He wanted certainty that his chosen successor would remain untouched. "Richard?" I said softly, using his first name for the first time in my life. His eyes immediately lifted to mine. If Grandpa were alive today, would he ignore these reports? He couldn't answer. That silence hurt more than any argument. Before leaving, I stopped at the doorway. One day you're going to have to decide whether you're protecting your son or protecting his mistakes. He didn't stop me. He didn't even turn around. The next morning, Bennett Industrial announced Nathan's official CEO celebration luncheon. Invitations went to senior executives, key investors, longtime clients, and members of the Bennett family. The timing wasn't accidental. Nathan wanted photographs of smiling shareholders before any audit could raise questions. Daniel looked at the invitation and smiled for the first time in days. Perfect. Why? Because he'll make one final speech. I frowned. So, confident people talk too much. We attended separately. I sat near the back of the ballroom while Nathan greeted guests like a man already crowned king. My mother beamed with pride. My father shook hands with investors. Waiters carried champagne through the room. If anyone suspected the company was under investigation, they hid it well. Nathan eventually stepped onto the stage beneath a giant screen displaying the words "A New Generation of Leadership." He thanked employees, he thanked investors, then he thanked our parents for believing in him from the very beginning. Finally, his eyes found me. Most importantly, he said with a practiced smile, "I'd like to thank my sister Claire. Even though we haven't always agreed, I know she'll eventually support what's best for our family." The room applauded politely. I smiled back but said nothing. Nathan mistook my silence for surrender. He had no idea that while he stood beneath the spotlight celebrating a victory he hadn't legally secured, every word he spoke was being recorded, every financial statement behind him had already been frozen for forensic review, and the independent committee had just voted unanimously to expand the investigation into executive misconduct. Halfway through dessert, Evelyn quietly entered the ballroom with two outside legal advisors. She didn't interrupt the event. She simply walked to my table and placed a sealed envelope beside my plate. "The committee voted 10 minutes ago," she whispered. I looked at the envelope. "What's inside? The official notice?" "Oh, of what?" Evelyn smiled very slightly. "Nathan still thinks today is the happiest day of his career." She glanced toward the stage where my brother laughed with investors completely unaware of what was about to happen. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "he's going to learn that the trap has already closed." I arrived at headquarters before sunrise the next morning. The building looked exactly as it always had, but the atmosphere felt completely different. Security officers stood quietly near every entrance. Several outside attorneys waited in the executive conference room with thick binders stacked neatly in front of them. Nobody smiled. Nobody made small talk. The confidence that had filled the building during Nathan's celebration luncheon had disappeared overnight, replaced by cautious whispers and uncertain looks. As I stepped off the elevator, Evelyn met me outside the boardroom. "Are you ready?" she asked. I looked through the glass wall into the conference room where my grandfather's portrait still overlooked every meeting. "Don't know," I admitted. "But I'm done running from the truth." She nodded and opened the door. Every voting member of the board was already seated. My father sat near the center, looking older than I had ever seen him. My mother had been invited only as a family observer. She kept twisting her wedding ring without realizing she was doing it. Nathan entered last, carrying himself with the same confidence he always had. He looked around the room and frowned. "Why are outside counsel here?" One of the attorneys calmly replied, "Please take your seat, Mr. Bennett." Nathan looked toward my father. "Dad?" My father avoided his eyes. That was the first crack. Nathan sat down slowly. Evelyn called the meeting to order. "This special session has been convened under the authority of the Independent Governance Review Committee." Nathan interrupted almost immediately. "What exactly is this about?" Evelyn didn't answer him. Instead, she turned to the lead forensic accountant. "Please summarize your findings." The accountant stood and connected his laptop to the large screen. The first slide displayed a timeline covering the previous 5 years. Every questionable transaction Daniel and I had uncovered now appeared in chronological order. One by one, the accountant explained the shell companies, the unauthorized consulting agreements, the manipulated approval process, the altered governance records, and the executive expenditures disguised as strategic investments. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. Facts carried their own weight. Nathan leaned back with an expression that mixed irritation and disbelief. "Those are accounting issues," he said. "Accounting issues happen in every company." The accountant calmly clicked to the next slide. Accounting issues do not normally involve concealed beneficial ownership. A corporate ownership chart appeared on the screen, connecting every shell company back to relatives and longtime associates personally selected by Nathan. My brother's confidence faded slightly. Those firms provided legitimate services. Please identify those services, the accountant replied. Nathan opened his mouth but never answered. The room remained silent long enough for everyone to understand why. Then Daniel stood. This was the first time many board members had realized he had participated in the investigation. He presented the server logs showing unauthorized access to my corporate account while I was hospitalized. Timestamp after timestamp appeared across the screen. Every approval supposedly made by me during those 2 weeks had originated from executive headquarters, while my medical records confirmed I was unconscious. Nathan immediately looked toward me. "You're accusing me of identity fraud now." I calmly met his eyes. "I'm presenting evidence. This is revenge because you lost the vote." I almost smiled. "There was never a final vote, Nathan." Before he could respond, Evelyn reached into a leather folder and removed the document my grandfather had hidden years earlier. "The board has now verified the authenticity of an amendment executed by Charles Bennett." She handed copies to every voting member. Nathan frowned as he scanned the title. "Integrity Clause." My father looked genuinely confused. "I've never seen this before." "Neither had I answered. Evelyn continued reading aloud. Substantial evidence demonstrates that any CO candidate has intentionally violated fiduciary duties, manipulated governance procedures, or concealed material facts from the board. All succession authority shall immediately transfer to the Independent Governance Review Committee pending final determination. Nathan's face lost all color. "This isn't real." One of the outside attorneys spoke for the first time. "It has already been authenticated by the original law firm, 2 surviving witnesses, and the state archives." My brother looked desperately toward our father. "Dad, say something." My father lowered his eyes. I didn't know. It was the first time in my life I had ever seen Nathan look frightened. Real fear, not frustration. "Claire planned this," he snapped. "She waited until I accepted the nomination." I shook my head slowly. "No, Nathan. Grandpa planned this years ago." Daniel then played the recovered surveillance footage from the parking garage. The damaged video appeared on the screen exactly as I had seen it before. The room watched in complete silence as I walked toward my car, answered my phone, and disappeared into the corrupted section of the recording. Then the frozen image appeared. My body lay motionless beside scattered documents, while another person stood over me wearing the Bennett family cufflink. My mother covered her mouth. "Oh my God." Nathan immediately pointed toward the screen. "You can't even identify the person." "You're right," Daniel answered. "Not from the video." He picked up another folder. "Fortunately, we didn't rely only on the video." He projected electronic door access records from the parking garage. "At the exact time of my accident, only 3 executive access badges entered that level. Mine, Nathan's, and Marcus Bennett's." Nathan looked shocked. "Marcus." The next document answered the question before anyone asked it. Cell phone location records obtained through a court order placed Marcus beside Nathan less than 2 minutes before my fall. Then came text messages recovered from Marcus's company phone after the audit began. One message read, "She's leaving now." Another followed seconds later. "Handle it before she talks to anyone." The room froze. Nathan stared at the screen as though he had never seen the messages before. "I didn't write those." Daniel nodded. "We know." He clicked again. The sender's name appeared. Marcus Bennett. My cousin had sent the messages. The recipient's name then appeared beneath it. Nathan Bennett. My brother slowly stood from his chair. "I never told him to hurt Claire." Nobody answered. Finally, Nathan looked directly at me. "I swear I didn't." I believed him, at least partly. I didn't think Nathan had wanted me unconscious. I thought he had wanted me silenced long enough to secure the CO position. That realization didn't make anything better. It only made the tragedy more pathetic. My father suddenly stood as well. His voice shook so badly I barely recognized it. "Nathan." He looked around the room before continuing. "Tell me this isn't true." Nathan didn't answer immediately. His eyes filled with tears for the first time since we were children. "I only wanted one chance," he whispered. "Everything was supposed to be mine." My father closed his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "Nothing was ever yours. It was entrusted to us." That single sentence shattered whatever remained of Nathan's confidence. He collapsed back into his chair, buried his face in his hands, and for the first time in his life had no speech prepared, no excuse polished enough, and no one left willing to protect him. Evelyn looked around the table before speaking the final motion. Based on the findings presented today, I move that Nathan Bennett be permanently disqualified from consideration for the office of Chief Executive Officer, that all succession proceedings be declared void, and that the matter be referred for independent legal review. One by one, every board member raised a hand, even my father. The vote was unanimous. As the meeting officially ended, my father walked slowly toward me. His shoulders seemed smaller than I had ever seen them. "Claire," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I spent years believing I was protecting this family." Tears filled his eyes as he looked toward Nathan sitting alone at the far end of the room. Instead, I almost destroyed it. Walking out of that boardroom should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt strangely quiet. For weeks I had imagined the moment the truth finally came out. I thought I would feel satisfied watching Nathan lose everything he had spent years believing was already his. I thought seeing my parents realize how deeply they had failed me would somehow erase the pain of being overlooked my entire life. None of that happened. What I felt instead was exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones after carrying a weight you never should have been asked to carry in the first place. News of the board's decision spread through Bennett Industrial within hours. Employees whispered in hallways. Investors demanded emergency updates. Reporters began calling the communications department before lunch. By the end of the day, the company released a short public statement confirming that the CEO succession process had been suspended pending an independent governance review. Nathan's name wasn't mentioned. Neither was mine. For the first time since this nightmare began, the story wasn't about personalities. It was about protecting the company. That mattered to me more than I expected. While the public only saw a brief announcement, the board spent the next several days reversing every decision Nathan had made after my accident. Contracts signed without proper authority were frozen. Vendor payments were suspended. Every executive authorization issued during my hospitalization was reviewed again from the beginning. Daniel worked almost nonstop alongside the external auditors, and every evening he called with another update. "We're almost done," he told me one night. "The company is stable," had Nathan. There was a pause. "His attorney requested copies of the investigation." I nodded quietly. "He has that right. You're taking this better than I expected." I looked out the apartment window at the city lights below. "I'm not trying to destroy him, Daniel. I know. I'm trying to make sure no one can ever do this again." 2 days later, my father asked if we could meet. Not at the company, not at the estate. He chose the small lakeside park where my grandfather used to take Nathan and me fishing every summer. I almost declined, but something inside me knew this conversation had been coming for years. He was already sitting on a weathered wooden bench when I arrived. For several minutes neither of us spoke. The lake remained perfectly still. Finally he sighed. "I owe you more apologies than I know how to give." I remained silent. "After your grandfather died," he continued, "I convinced myself that keeping the family united meant supporting Nathan no matter what. Every time someone questioned him, I defended him. Every mistake became someone else's fault. Every warning became an overreaction." He looked down at his hands, "Including yours. You never even opened the reports I gave you," I said quietly. He nodded. "Because I was afraid." That answer surprised me. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid your grandfather had been right." I frowned. He looked at me with tired eyes. Warned me years ago that loving one child more loudly than another would eventually destroy both of them. I thought he was exaggerating. My chest tightened. Dad wiped his eyes before continuing. "I didn't just fail you, Claire. I failed Nathan too. I raised him to believe he deserved leadership instead of earning it." Neither of us spoke for a long time after that. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. Before leaving, Dad reached into his coat pocket and placed a small velvet box beside me. Inside was the Bennett family chairman's pin, the symbol worn by every company leader for 3 generations. "The board wants you to have this?" I closed the box and handed it back. "No." He looked confused. "You've earned it? Maybe someday?" "Then why refuse?" I smiled gently. Because this was never about wearing Grandpa's pin. It was about protecting what it stood for. 3 days later, the board officially offered me the CEO position. Every member voted in favor. Even Evelyn admitted she couldn't imagine anyone more qualified after everything that had happened. I thanked them sincerely before declining. The room looked stunned. One director finally asked the question everyone else was thinking. Why? I took a slow breath before answering. Because the company doesn't need another Bennett running everything alone. It needs a system that prevents this from ever happening again. Instead, I accepted the newly created role of Executive Chair for Governance and Ethics. My responsibility would be overseeing board independence, executive accountability, succession planning, and compliance across the company. Daily operations would be handled by an experienced outside executive selected through an open national search instead of family inheritance. Grandpa would have approved. My mother came to see me that evening. She looked smaller somehow, as if the certainty she had carried for decades had finally disappeared. She sat quietly in my office before speaking. I always thought I was protecting my son. I looked at her gently. You were protecting the version of him you wanted to believe existed. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Can you ever forgive me? I didn't answer immediately because forgiveness deserved honesty. I don't know if I'm ready today. She nodded through her tears. That's fair. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating you either. She reached across the desk and squeezed my hand. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was simply the first truthful conversation we had shared in years. A week later, Nathan requested permission to meet me before leaving town. His attorney had negotiated his resignation from every position within Bennett Industrial, and Marcus was cooperating separately with investigators. I almost refused the meeting. Then I remembered something Grandpa once told me. You never truly know a person's character until they have nothing left to gain. Nathan arrived alone. He looked nothing like the confident man who had stood on stage announcing his future as CEO. His expensive suits were gone. The arrogance had disappeared from his face. He sat across from me in silence for nearly a full minute before speaking. I used to think you wanted what I had. I looked at him calmly. I wanted what Grandpa wanted. He nodded slowly. I know that now. He rubbed his hands together before continuing. Marcus told me he was only going to stop you from taking those documents to the board. I believed him. Heard when I ended up in the hospital. He lowered his head. I convinced myself it was an accident because admitting anything else would have destroyed everything. It did anyway? I know. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. I'm sorry. For the first time since all of this began, I believed he meant it. Not because he had lost his position. Not because he had lost the company. But because he had finally realized he had spent his entire life chasing an inheritance while destroying the family it was supposed to serve. I stood and walked him to the door. I hope you build a life you're proud of someday. He nodded quietly. I hope you do too. Then he walked away without looking back, and I realized I wasn't watching my brother leave. I was watching the end of the lie our family had lived for decades. Almost a year passed before I realized I had gone an entire week without thinking about the board vote, the hospital, or the missing 2 weeks that had once consumed every waking moment of my life. Healing didn't happen on the day the investigation ended or the morning Nathan resigned. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, through ordinary mornings, honest conversations, and the slow realization that my future no longer depended on correcting the past. Bennett Industrial looked different too. The changes weren't dramatic enough for newspaper headlines, but they transformed the company from the inside. Every major executive decision now required independent oversight. Succession planning became transparent instead of personal. Anonymous ethics reporting expanded across every division. And family members could no longer bypass governance procedures simply because they shared the Bennett name. For decades, our greatest weakness had been believing loyalty meant silence. Now loyalty meant accountability. Looking back, I realized that was the inheritance Grandpa had actually wanted to leave us. A month after the board appointed the new outside CEO, I stood in the lobby watching employees arrive for work. Most of them had no idea who I was beyond my role as executive chair. They didn't whisper when I walked by. They didn't compare me to Nathan. They simply greeted me the way they greeted everyone else. It felt strangely liberating. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove I deserved to belong inside my own family's company. I simply belonged because I had earned my place. Daniel eventually returned to his normal responsibilities, though we still met every Friday morning for coffee. One morning he smiled as he handed me the latest compliance report. "Do you know something?" he asked. "What?" "We've had 3 consecutive quarters without a single governance violation." I laughed. "Don't say that too loudly. You'll jinx us?" He grinned. "I'll take my chances." We had both learned that healthy organizations weren't built on perfect people. They were built on systems strong enough to survive imperfect people. Evelyn retired 6 months later. At her farewell dinner, she raised a glass and looked directly at me. "Your grandfather once told me that one day this company would face a choice between convenience and integrity." She smiled warmly. "I'm glad you chose the harder path." Before leaving, she placed a worn leather notebook in my hands. It had belonged to Grandpa. Inside were decades of handwritten observations about leadership, responsibility, and family businesses. The final page contained only one sentence. "Never protect the family by sacrificing the truth. Protect the truth, and the family still worth saving will remain." I framed that page in my office. My relationship with my parents improved slowly. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no emotional speeches that erased years of hurt. Trust returned the same way it had been lost, one decision at a time. My father never tried to justify what he had done again. Instead, he accepted responsibility every time the subject came up. We had dinner together once a month, and although there were still moments of sadness between us, there was no longer dishonesty. My mother started volunteering with a nonprofit that helped families prepare succession plans for small businesses. One evening, she admitted something I never expected to hear. "I confused loving Nathan with protecting him from consequences." She shook her head. "All I really did was postpone the consequences until they became much worse." I squeezed her hand. "Neither of us pretended the past could be rewritten. We simply chose not to repeat it." Nathan wrote twice during that first year. The first letter was mostly an apology. The second was different. He told me he had accepted an operations position at a manufacturing company in another state. There was no executive title, no corner office, no family influence waiting to rescue him. He wrote that every promotion would have to be earned. And for the first time in his life, he understood why Grandpa had always insisted that responsibility should come before authority. At the end of the letter he wrote, "I spent years trying to inherit respect instead of earning it. I don't know if I'll ever deserve your forgiveness, but I'm finally trying to deserve my own." I folded the letter and placed it inside the same notebook where I kept Grandpa's final message. Not because everything had been forgiven, but because pretending none of it happened would have taught me nothing. On the anniversary of my accident, I visited Grandpa's grave alone. The morning was quiet, and a light breeze moved through the old oak trees surrounding the cemetery. I placed a small bouquet beside the headstone and sat there longer than I expected. "You were right," I said softly. I did have to choose. I smiled through tears that no longer came from anger. "Thank you for believing I would make the right one." As I walked back toward my car, I realized something that had taken me nearly a year to understand. The greatest thing I recovered after those missing 2 weeks wasn't my memory. It was my ability to trust myself again. Nathan lost the chance to become CEO because he believed leadership was something his family owed him. My parents lost years they could have spent treating their children equally because they confused favoritism with love. I almost lost my life because the truth threatened someone else's ambition, but I refused to let any of those losses define the rest of my future. People often ask whether exposing my own family was worth everything it cost. My answer is always the same. I didn't choose between my family and my grandfather's company. I chose between protecting a lie and protecting the values that built both. Sometimes karma isn't loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly through evidence, accountability, and the courage to tell the truth when everyone else wants your silence. And if you had been sitting in my chair that day, holding the deciding vote that could either protect your family or protect what was right, what would you have chosen?